Okay. So what I wanted to talk about today in Jews and the News is a disturbing topic. Somebody's coming in. Yeah. So what I wanted to talk about today is something that made the news last week, but did not make the news here in Washington, which is unusual. And this is a rabbi in Cleveland, Ohio, who I know from rabbinical school days. I wouldn't call him a friend necessarily. I was friendly with him during rabbinical school, but then our paths separated and kind of kept, what rabbis do, we kind of keep track of each other as our careers progress. And so this friend of mine, Rabbi Steve Weiss, has been the senior rabbi of one of the big conservative synagogues in Cleveland for the past 20 years. So he was, and more people coming in. Okay, so Rabbi Steve Weiss was assistant rabbi of a large synagogue in Detroit, and then at a large synagogue in Atlanta, like the largest synagogue in Atlanta, for a few years, and then became senior rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun in Cleveland, Ohio. So, and like I said, he's been there for 20 years, doing well. I'm friends with him on Facebook, so kind of follow what he's been doing. His wife is a daughter of a conservative rabbi, and nice people. Rabbi Steve Weiss, even though sometimes rabbis of large synagogues, their ego gets the better of them. That's not the impression I have of Rabbi Steve Weiss, who always came across as a very down-to-earth, humble person. So it turns out that Rabbi Steve Weiss was arrested last Monday in front of a house in Cleveland, in a different neighborhood than the neighborhood that he lives in. Arrested with some paraphernalia to be used for sexual activity. And apparently he was there, parked in front of this house, in order to meet the person that he had emailed, a minor boy. So he was arrested with, again, the paraphernalia in his car, because he did not have an email correspondence with a boy like he thought he did. He had an email correspondence with an undercover Ohio police officer. So that Ohio police officer arrested him for having shown up to this meeting ready to engage in illegal sexual activity. So he was arrested and released with an ankle bracelet, an ankle monitor, on $50,000 bond. And the synagogue in Cleveland met the executive board of the synagogue. This was 3:00 in the afternoon on Monday. That evening, like just a couple hours later, the executive board met and unanimously agreed to suspend Rabbi Stephen Weiss as rabbi and prohibit him from entering the property of the synagogue. And if you go on to B'nai Jeshurun's website, which I did last Tuesday, he's no longer there on the website, and there's no inkling at all that Steve Weiss ever was the rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun. So this came as a shock to me, because not because a rabbi was engaged in this illicit activity, because we know of rabbis who have done that in the past, especially somebody in our own area in Potomac, related to a member of our congregation. And there are plenty of other rabbis across the country who have been involved in this. So the shock to me is that I knew him, right? It's always more of a shock when you know the person, because as I described Rabbi Steve Weiss to you, nothing, and you know, this is always funny, in that people always say, oh, I knew that person who became a serial murderer, or I knew that person who committed that burglary. And there's nothing about them that would have suggested that they would have done such a thing. As if we have something, like we have a sign that we're wearing, or some other kind of attribute that would claim stay away sexual deviant, or stay away criminal here, right? Nobody looks like a criminal, and that's the scary thing. How well do we really know our rabbi? How well do we really know the people who we come to trust? So that's one of the difficult things here. The other bigger question, of course, is the trust that that congregants have for their clergy. And you know, this is a much bigger issue in the Catholic Church, as we know, right? There are the whole country of Ireland is dealing with hundreds of cases of priests throughout Ireland who have engaged in sexual abuse. And priests around the world have been engaged in this. And the added terrible thing to it is that the Catholic Church hierarchy knew about it and swept it under the carpet, and allowed these priests to keep on getting jobs in different locations, right? There was the movie that came out a couple of years ago about the Boston Globe journalist who was uncovering clergy abuse in Boston. I forget the name of the movie. It was nominated for Academy Awards. I just don't remember the name of it. But anyway, you know the movie I'm talking about. And that's just one of many cases in America, let alone around the world. And just last week in New Jersey, 2 different archdioceses in New Jersey settled multi-million-dollar lawsuits for clergy priests' sexual abuse. I think the Archdiocese of Camden settled a tens of $million suit, and the Archdiocese of Newark settled a hundreds of $million lawsuit. Just Google it, you'll see. Archdiocese, New Jersey settlement, and you'll see those cases. That's just recently. So within the Jewish community, so we know of the rabbi locally in Potomac 10, 15 years ago where this happened. Now this Rabbi Steve Weiss in Cleveland, Ohio, Rabbi Barry Freundel of Kesher, Israel, did time in prison for having videotaped women who were going to the mikveh. And I was just studying with my friend Rabbi Ethan Seidel before this, and he reminded me of somebody else somebody else from our rabbinical school days, a Rabbi Peter Light, who was in Tennessee, I believe, or maybe it was in New Jersey at the time, also accused of sexual abuse. So these are just four rabbis that I know of, and I'm sure there are plenty more rabbis. The conservative movement as a movement has been dealing with this because there was a USY director in Long Island who apparently for many years, if not decades, had been accused of, there were stories about and accused of sexual abuse at USY conventions, regional conventions. And for some reason, the conservative movement, USY, did nothing about it until just recently, where there was something came out. If you just Google United Synagogue, youth director report or something like that, I think that came out in the fall. And the Reform movement has been dealing with this as well. I think there was a professor at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati who was just let go or accused and then let go for having engaged in such behavior for years. And then I think it was just the professor, but there was also a rabbi, a prominent rabbi within the Reform movement too. So, and then Yeshiva University has dealt with this as well. And there are cases in Israel, right? Isn't there a woman who was supposed to be not deported, but I forget the word, where you're wanted for a crime in one country, but you're in another country. What's the word for taking that person from that country, bringing them back for trial in the original country? Whatever it is, there's this woman in Australia, a Jewish woman in Australia accused of sexual abuse.
Extradite.
Extradite, thank you. Yes. So this woman is finally extradited to either from Israel to Australia or from Australia to Israel for a trial for this sexual crimes, for sexual abuse. And yeah, so it's disgusting, it's horrific, it's awful. And just what I want to, what can I say about it? We don't need to go into the details of the crimes themselves. I think what I wanted to say about the clergy aspect of it, from the rabbinic aspect of this, is that the trust that congregants have in their clergy, and the for whatever reason, clergy engaging in illegal activity is, to say the least, breaching the trust of rabbi congregation. But even more than that, I think there's an image that congregants have of their rabbi, or congregants of whatever religion have of their clergy. It's more so in the Catholic Church, where the priest is supposed to be a representative of God on earth, right? And the priest is supposed to be a holy person. In the Torah, the priest and that subcategory of the tribe of Levi, the Kohanim, are a subcategory of the tribe of Levi. They're just designated by God for this holy task. They're not inherently holier than anybody else in the Jewish community. Okay, so the tribe of Levi is not holier than any other tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel. They are just the ones designated by God for this holy task. And therefore, they have some restrictions on their behavior that other members of the 12 tribes do not have, right? So in order to reflect their holiness, a priest, a Kohen, is not supposed to marry a divorcee. And the high priest is not supposed to marry a widow. But everybody else in the Jewish community is allowed to marry a divorcee or a widow. But the priest is not supposed to, because it reflects kind of a holier behavior that a priest is supposed to have. Also, a Kohen is not supposed to defile himself with impurity by attending a funeral or being around the dead, because a Kohen has holy work to do, and the Kohen cannot be impacted by impurity of any kind that would affect the work that they're supposed to do. So a Kohen today, the Kohen who wants to maintain their Kohen status, their traditional Kohen status, will not attend a funeral today or walk into a cemetery. So, but that it's not because they are inherently holier. It's because they were designated to be in this category that they have to behave holier. Okay, as opposed to a Catholic priest who, by studying for the priesthood, becomes a representative of God on earth, right? You can only, if you're a Catholic and you want to confess your sins, you can only do so to a priest, right? You can only attend Mass that is conducted by a priest, right? There are certain things that only a priest can do because they are God's representative on earth. So it doesn't work that way in Judaism. Anybody can become a rabbi as long as they have the requisite study and background. There's nothing about me or my father that is inherently different than any of you. It's just that we went to rabbinical school and we had the background to enable us to become rabbis. But anybody who wants to can become. So it's once we become rabbis that we understand that we have to live up to what it means to be a rabbi. So it's like what I thought of this morning, but I remember way back in the 80s, the late 80s, early 90s, when I lived in Massachusetts, there was a player for the Boston Celtics. Maybe it was Reggie Lewis, is that possible? Who was arrested for something and said, "I'm not a role model." It famously, a Boston Celtic player said, "I'm not a role model. So what are you upset with me that I'm getting arrested? I'm just like anybody else. I'm not a role model." But okay, we can argue about celebrities and athletes and whether they're role models or not, and whether their behavior, they should behave accordingly, knowing that they're always in the public eye. So we can argue about celebrities and athletes and whether they need to live up to a higher standard of behavior than anybody else. But we could argue that rabbis are expected to and should live up to a higher standard of behavior. That first and foremost, rabbis should be following and observing the 613 commandments to the best of our ability, right? That should go without saying, that a rabbi is expected to observe Jewish law. At least a conservative rabbi is expected to observe Jewish practice and ritual according to conservative movement ideology. That's what we're expected to do. So obviously, being arrested means that you're not following the commandments, right? You have just transgressed, and therefore you are not fulfilling your responsibility as a Jew, and by extension, your responsibility as a rabbi. So yes, we are role models. We do fulfill a particular standard of living whether we like it or not, this is what is expected of us, and this is what we need to do. Okay, and anybody who is not who is a pulpit rabbi and thinks that they are not in the public eye and shouldn't be any different, well, in my mind, they shouldn't be a pulpit rabbi because it just goes with the territory. Okay, so civil disobedience, that's an interesting question, Lori. So that, yes, for social justice things like getting arrested in front of the Russian embassy if you're protesting the war in Ukraine, or back in the 70s, protesting, asking for Russia to let the Jews go, right? And supporting refuseniks or things like that, or marching with Martin Luther King and in Selma, Alabama, or something, and with the knowledge that you might get arrested, those kinds of things, or anti-Vietnam War protests, or things like that. I would say absolutely, if that's your social justice thing to do, then absolutely do that. And I think civil disobedience is this gray area that even though there's a potential of being arrested, you should still do it. And that I don't have a problem with that. And I think that certain congregations expect their rabbi to be arrested for something like that. Okay, so yeah, so that's a good point, Lori, to bring that up. But I think that that's something. And again, the more social action, social justice oriented, the more social justice oriented the congregation, the more social justice oriented they expect the rabbi to be, and that they would see it as a matter of pride that their rabbi got arrested for that. Okay, so what I'm talking about are other things, like I know a rabbi who was arrested for having marijuana in his car. Okay, so that was in the state of New York. This was before states now allow a certain amount for you to be in possession of a certain amount of marijuana for recreational use. You're allowed to be in possession of it, even though it might be illegal to be smoking it. I don't know. Different states have different, and different jurisdictions have different rules about possession of marijuana. Okay, so this was before the state of New York had any law, and that he was arrested for marijuana possession. He's still in his job, and he was not fired, was not suspended, was not fired from his congregation for that, right? But it's long past the days when Bill Clinton had to say, "I did not inhale." Now I think it's okay to say, "I inhaled," and that you could still get elected president of the country if you claim to have inhaled in college. But back in 1992, you could not. So the standards of behavior that we expect a rabbi to live up to, I think, are appropriate. And so I think that it's a devastating impact the arrest of a rabbi could have on the congregation, because it's a breach of trust, and it is that's number one. And number two, it kind of pops the bubble of what we expect rabbis to be as human beings. And if a rabbi is arrested, then there goes my whole vision of who the rabbi is, and my whole vision of what Judaism is, right? If the rabbi then makes fun of Judaism by getting arrested, right? This is I have no idea Rabbi Stephen Weiss's mental health. I have no idea. One could assume that a rabbi who gets arrested for a crime would have some kind of mental health issue going on. But I don't know. I don't know. So I think that there's a certain level of compassion that we should have for Rabbi Steve Weiss and other rabbis, but that compassion might wear thin if it's in a Catholic church and the priest has done it multiple times and allowed to have done it multiple times. The priest may have mental health issues, but then it's the bigger church issue to be upset about for allowing this priest to still remain on the job and injure many more children. So Rabbi Steve Weiss's case is very different from priests in the Catholic Church. This is a one-time event as far as the state of Ohio knows. Rabbi Steve Weiss was never arrested, never alleged to have done anything else wrong before. So clearly something is going on, but still there's a bubble that the B'nai Jeshurun community in Cleveland, Ohio, Pepper Pike, Ohio, has of their rabbi who represents Judaism for them. And so if the representative of Judaism gets arrested, then what does it mean about Judaism in general? And is it a farce? If the rabbi thinks it's a farce because the rabbi allowed himself to get arrested, or maybe then the whole thing is a farce and maybe I don't need to be Jewish or to observe these laws either, right? We kind of upend clergy who get arrested, upend the picture of what religion is supposed to be and what religious life is supposed to be. And that, I think, there's multiple devastating effects that the arrest of a rabbi has on the rabbi's community when this happens. And I think that, again, knowing that there could be some mental health issues here at play, still the domino effect is devastating on the B'nai Jeshurun community, and then the rabbinic community at large, and the conservative movement even larger. So I think that, so I was thinking, and I haven't done this yet, that I need to talk to the president of our synagogue to set up a committee to make sure that we have policies in place to protect our congregation from employees in the congregation. Now, in other words, I'm sure we have some HR policies here about me, about the executive director, the cantor, teachers in our religious school, teachers in our preschool back in the day. So I think this is something to explore. We need to make sure that we have policies in place to ensure that our congregants are safe and that our children are safe. And, and I think it's important for it to come from me to say that in light of these, we have to make sure that I'm making sure, and that our congregation is making sure that we're all safe when we come into the building. And when we have contact with anybody in the building, that we should feel safe and we can trust the people that we're coming into contact with. That it's standard business practice, it's standard educational practice, it should be standard synagogue practice as well. So that's about all that I wanted to say about this. Any questions or comments and thoughts that you have about this? Yes, Lori.
Yeah, just based on what you've been talking about, I've been wondering, is there any place for rabbis to go when they're struggling with, what sounds like it could be an addiction?
Right. So that's a very good question, Lori. And as far as I know, within the conservative movement, we have the one rabbinic organization known as the Rabbinical Assembly. The Rabbinical Assembly advertises on all of the emails that it sends out to its members almost every email has something there about a rabbinic hotline, so that if 24/7, there's somebody to call if you have a mental health issue. But that's just, it's very generic. And hopefully that person or whoever answers the hotline can direct the person to the appropriate agency here for whatever kind of addiction it is or mental health issue it is, whether it's suicide, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, whatever it is, sexual addiction, whatever the mental health issue, anxiety, that there's somebody to talk to. But within specifically the Rabbinical Assembly, there isn't a separate number to call or unit set up to handle sexual abuse. There isn't. We don't have that in the conservative movement. I don't think the Orthodox, I'm not sure whether the Reform has it. It's possible the Reform movement has it. I'm not sure. And I don't know about Orthodoxy. And the Orthodoxy is subdivided into I mean, the standard modern Orthodox rabbinic organization is the RCA, the Rabbinic Council of America, but there are other rabbinic councils also, not just in North America, but in Israel and other places around the world. So I really don't know whether within the other rabbinic organizations of the other denominations that such a thing exists. It says a lot that it doesn't. It's kind of like we turned a blind eye to this, but you know, if it happens in the general population, then rabbis will do it too. It's just that there are less rabbis than there are people in the 350 million Americans. There are 1,600 members of the Rabbinical Assembly. Okay, so it's 0.01% of American citizens are members of the Rabbinical Assembly, but the members of the Rabbinical Assembly are international. So I don't know how many are American. I think there's a way to on the database to find out how many of the 1,600 live in America. I really don't know. I think the Israel region of the Rabbinical Assembly is the largest region of all the regions around the world, mainly made up of retired rabbis who live there. But so what? Maybe there are 1,000 Rabbinical Assembly members in America. So a drop in the bucket, but it's whatever the percentage of the American population has sexual addiction, that same percentage would apply to rabbis. So, and it's
anything like that involves shame, people are going to start living secret lives.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And you know, and so it gets to the broader mental health issues, because mental health, as opposed to physical health, is often silent and invisible. Okay, I'm just randomly looking around our screen. We don't know whether any of us have any kind of mental illness going on because we can hide it. You don't see it. But if one of us had a broken nose, you would see it. You can't hide a broken nose. So I don't know if Danny or Rita has a broken nose because they don't have their video showing. But anybody with their video showing, if you have a broken nose, you see it. Right. Okay, Rita, now we see you. It's proven you don't have a broken nose. I don't mean to laugh about this because it's a very, very serious issue. That's why mental health is so difficult to deal with in this way, right? Because you can hide it. And if you don't want to hide it, nobody sees it. So you look normal. What do you mean you have a mental health issue? And then how do you go about diagnosing it? How do you go about dealing with it, right? And this is an issue for health insurance. Health insurance coverage for mental health issues is woefully lacking. No matter what health insurance you have, if you have a broken nose, that's most likely covered by health insurance 100%, or based on your deductible. But if you need therapy, if you have a sexual addiction and you need therapy, that's not covered. Or maybe a small portion of it is covered. So only wealthy people can afford to be mentally ill in order to get treatment. And that's a major, major problem in America. Okay, so it's not just a problem within the rabbinical assembly and how to deal with rabbis who have mental health issues. It's a bigger issue in America, how to deal with people in America who have mental health issues. It's a major, major problem, right? Wasn't there a delegate from Virginia a couple of years ago whose son stabbed him several times, and that son obviously had mental health issues, and there was no bed available in any hospital nearby. And this guy is a delegate to the House of Delegates in Virginia. You would think he would have access for his son to have a bed in a mental health institution. The beds are lacking, and it's a major, major problem. So so therapy for someone who has a mental health issue, a sexual addiction, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, suicidal thoughts, anxieties, depression, lots of these things are hidden. And therefore, because you look normal, there's an expectation that you act normal. And if you don't, then people just don't know what to do with you. And you would think in 2022, we would know better and that we'd be more advanced and be sensitive to this, but we're not. And it's a lot of work needs to be done in this country about this. Any other thoughts or comments about this?
Yeah, what do you do with rabbis that make outrageous comments? And is there anyone to police them?
What do you mean? What kind of outrageous?
Oh, well, like there's this Orthodox rabbi, Yosef Mizrahi. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
Okay, he put out a video that said Zelensky was never circumcised. He's married to a non-Jew. His children aren't Jewish. He said that while he was president, Ukraine voted 35 times for the Palestinians versus the Israelis.
Okay.
I don't know if it's true or not. I Googled him.
Right. That's interesting. Is there a policing of opinions of rabbis on in the media? Well, so this is interesting. So behind the scenes, there is a listserv for conservative rabbis called RavNet. And there's always a debate about opinions that rabbis post to RavNet, whether the opinions themselves are outrageous or the claims that they are making about other rabbis, like they're trying to engage in dialogue on RavNet itself. Is that allowed, like insulting, derogatory kind of claims? So that one rabbi who has particularly politically conservative views and is very opinionated about it and likes to write a lot on RavNet about it, might have said something, because I don't read whenever these rabbis post, and they're known who they are from those who are on RavNet. Whenever they post, I never read. I just delete. But other people read every single post that happens, that goes out. So apparently this one rabbi said something nasty about another rabbi. And so he was suspended from RavNet for a month. So there is that kind of moderation that happens. There is a moderator of RavNet. But in terms of if a conservative rabbi, member of the rabbinical assembly, publishes something in the media that is not fact-based, I don't think there's anything. We have an ethics committee, so it would be up to the ethics committee to decide whether that violated the ethics of the rabbinical assembly. I'll tell you, the new dean of the rabbinical school, newly appointed dean, is a Rabbi Ayelet Cohen. And she was brought up to the ethics committee for violating placement procedures because she served as a rabbi of a synagogue that's not a member of the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. So she violated placement rules by serving the gay and lesbian synagogue Beit Simcha in Manhattan. So there's nothing wrong with a conservative rabbi serving in a non-conservative rabbi congregation necessarily, but it's just interesting that the new dean of the rabbinical school is someone who had violated placement procedures. So she wasn't kicked out of the rabbinical assembly for that. So there are different issues that could warrant somebody being brought up on charges to the ethics committee. I'll give you another example that is public knowledge. So Rabbi Maltzman who used to be at Bethel and Bethesda was alleged to have misappropriated discretionary fund monies from the synagogue. So he was asked to leave his position as the senior rabbi. And then a bunch of people from that synagogue who were loyal supporters of Rabbi Maltzman, who again, these were alleged, I don't think nothing went to court or anything like that, wanted to follow him and start their own synagogue, Kol Shalom in Rockville, as a breakaway from Bethel and Bethesda. So I happen to have been president of the regional conservative rabbis at the time. And I was asked by the executive director of the Rabbinical Assembly to meet with Rabbi Maltzman and Rabbi Rudolph to kind of mediate a discussion about Rabbi Maltzman leading that synagogue and whether that's appropriate within just a couple miles of Bethel. So an issue like that, the Rabbinical Assembly is able to handle. A crime like clergy abuse, I'm not so sure. Or stating opinions like that Rabbi Saul that you were saying, derogatory statements, inflammatory statements, maybe wrong, factually wrong statements. Is there something that the Rabbinical Assembly can do to defrock me as a rabbi, if that's a mixing metaphors there? I'm not sure the Rabbinical Assembly is set up to do that. And I'm not sure that it could be in a policy that if you're convicted of a crime, then you automatically are not considered a member of the Rabbinical Assembly anymore. That could very well be. I'd have to check the Constitution of the Rabbinical Assembly. Okay, I have to stop here for today to get ready for my 12 o'clock booster shot at the Giant. So hopefully we'll have better topics to talk about in the weeks ahead. Actually, next Monday, we will not have a class. So we will not have Jews and the News next Monday. Medical appointments with my parents next Monday. Everything's fine. But so we'll meet again in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from today will be our next session. Have a good rest of the day.